So in terms of the scientific method, we want to be able to, avoid confirmation bias. We want to avoid what's called, belief perseverance, right? Even when you're faced with lots of evidence to the contrary, you tend to persist in your belief. We want to be able to, avoid overconfidence, which is a pretty significant issue amongst many scientists, many people, where they, have a tendency to overestimate their ability to make correct predictions, across a wide variety of tasks. It turns out we are often much more confident in our predictive abilities than we have any right to be. And, this is a quote from an article that I've included here that's, one of the most common findings in behavioral decision research is that people have unrealistic beliefs about how much they know. Specifically, people tend to overestimate their knowledge and ability in many different domains, with this overestimation increasing with harder tasks and decreasing with easier tasks. We also want to avoid what's called hindsight bias, which is a tendency to overestimate, how well we could have successfully forecast, known outcomes, sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, right? Once an event has already occurred, it's easy in retrospect to predict it, quote, quote. There's a great quote from the physicist Niels Bohr, who said, prediction is difficult, especially for the future. So there are a number of different ways that experiments are kind of run, and a number of different ways that, data is gathered. One way that, data gathering occurs is through what we call naturalistic observation, which is basically observing people, individuals, subjects of any sort. An example that I've got here is, Jane Goodall, right? Observing, primates in the wild, and also Robert Sapolsky, who also did the same in Kenya with baboons. And, naturalistic observation, viewing, animals or people in, in their natural habitat is considered to be high in what we call external validity, which is the extent to which you can generalize your findings to sort of real world situations, because you're actually doing that observation, in real world settings. It is low in internal validity, however, which is the extent to which you can draw cause and effect inferences. And that's largely because in these naturalistic settings, there's a lot of variables that are at play. And it's not very easy to control variables. So this is not an experimental setting. This is, where you're trying very hard to sort of, control the number of variables that are at play so you can reveal cause and effect sorts of relationships. This is much more messy. It's the real world, right? Actually, that's something we're going to talk about a little bit in the discussion this week, too, is how social scientists often differentiate between what they call emic research. This is immersive, from the perspective of what they consider to be an insider, versus ethic, which is, sort of more observational, where you think you're outside the circumstance and you're just observing. And I want you to consider sort of what are some of the pluses and minuses of these approaches, and whether you're ever really truly immersed, in some kind of environment that you're attempting to study, as an emic researcher. Sapolsky has a great story about how he was working with baboons in Kenya, and he thought he was basically an etic researcher, just observing. He's sitting on a rock, and the alpha baboon comes over and just sort of casually shoves him off to make it pretty clear that you're not the alpha, and you're part of this group, and to some extent, and I'm in charge. So are you ever really completely outside as an observer without any impact on the people that you're actually observing? Now, I do want to point out there's another way of sort of gathering information and reporting information, and it's very common in psychology, actually, and in some aspects of neuroscience or neurology too. It's what we call case studies, where you examine like a specific patient and their particular concerns and their particular experiences. And these are often fascinating. They're stories, so they're innately sort of compelling to us. They're memorable. I mean, they're about individuals. You can sort of relate, perhaps. And they also can provide what we call existence proofs, which means that whatever they're experiencing, it's something that's being experienced. So it exists. This actually can happen. This is something that's there. And there's a great neuroscience researcher who's reported on a number of case studies. He actually delineated what's actually going on in the brain to some extent when we have phantom limb experiences, when you lose a limb and yet have this vivid kind of experience of an actual phantom limb remaining. And in other classes, particularly in our advanced neurophysiological psychology class, we're going to talk more about his work on phantom limb phenomenon. But initially these reports that were out, they seemed kind of wild. They seemed like they provided an existence proof that this occurred, and now we know it's extraordinarily common. It's recognized by the literature as extraordinarily common. And we have more of an understanding of the actual underlying physiology. So case studies, are compelling. They provide existence proofs. They offer insights that researchers can then follow up later with systematic investigations. But there also there's a danger. Right? You got to watch out that the plural of anecdote is not fact. Right? You want to follow up these anecdotal reports, these individual case study reports with experimental investigations and more gathering of evidence. So I was going to give you just one example. Ramachandran had a patient that he reported on who had this really remarkable syndrome called Capgras syndrome, where people it's often following some kind of a traumatic brain injury, but they recognize relatives, close relations, spouses, children, etc., but they do not acknowledge them as being that individual. They say that they are imposters. And this can happen with your pet, too. My dog's over here. There were some Freudian theories about this that were a little out there that involved attraction to your parents and all this stuff. But Ramachandran was curious because in the brain, there are pathways, from the eyes, right, where you're viewing somebody, who is familiar, for example, back through, we're going to see there's a central brain structure called the thalamus. There'll be some kind of an obligatory synaptic connection there. And then projections, again, this is information that's coming in through your eyes back to the back of the brain. This is called the occipital lobe. It's right in the middle here is where the primary visual cortex is located. And then from there are synaptic connections and projections into other parts of the brain. A lot of the brain is involved in sort of visual, perception, including into the temporal lobes, which we're going to see are going to become organized with visual experience in terms of developing networks that can recognize, particular classes of objects and specific, examples of objects. And objects in this term, they talk about the temporal lobe being involved in object recognition. That includes people. That includes like faces of other people, for example. So, the fascinating thing about the brain and our kinds of experiential aspects of perception, right? For example, you could recognize, utilizing some of these temporal lobe pathways, who somebody is, for example, or that's a face, for example. But this is also linked, these networks in the temporal lobe that are involved in recognizing faces are also linked to deeper structures in the brain that are involved in emotional experience and expression. So kind of like, if you see your mother or you see your spouse or you see your partner, you not only recognize them, right? There's an aspect of recognition, no, that's them, but you feel something. So his hypothesis was that, perhaps with the injury, the recognition pathway was still, intact. However, the emotional response links had been cut or damaged. And it was really interesting because that's a testable hypothesis. So you could, if you have an emotional response to something that you're being shown visually, there is activation of what we call the autonomic nervous system, a particular division known as the sympathetic division, which is involved in sort of, emotional arousal. And it involves like a little bit of sweat coming out on your skin. And so if you place electrodes on the skin and you show an image that provokes an emotional response, like an image of a spouse or a child or, your dog or your cat or something that's close or meaningful, you'll get like a burst of sweat. And if you have those electrodes there, you can trace what's called the galvanic skin response, or sometimes called the skin conductance response. And you'll see it'll leap up. And so he's saying, well, if these individuals have had an injury that allows them to recognize who their parent is, but not have that emotional response that's consonant with it, well then you should see kind of a flat galvanic skin response. And he brought in a number of individuals who suffered from Capgras syndrome, and that's what he found. So what's interesting is this is a case study that shows that this idea that that looks like my mother but it's not my mother, this imposter kind of syndrome, this Capgras syndrome exists, and it actually has with follow-up testing, and a hypothesis based on the natural science on what's actually going on in the brain, you can investigate and provide evidence for why this syndrome is occurring in these individuals. So case studies are really interesting, I think. I want you to think more about the advantages and disadvantages of all these different data gathering reports. One of the things about case studies I think that's most interesting is how it becomes a story, right? A very compelling tale of an individual's experience, and that's extremely memorable, and that helps people understand. They want to know what's going on in those circumstances, and so it can sort of motivate you to really follow the full investigation so we have a better understanding in the end.